In this segment, we're going to talk about gifts of charitable limited partnerships and LLCs. These tend to come up a fair amount, and at least the way that I learn best is going through case studies. So we're going to start right out of the gate with an assisted living center case study. We completed this about 2 months ago, so it's still fresh on my mind, but I think it should illuminate a number of the key planning aspects and considerations of using limited partnerships and LLCs as assets for charitable gifts. So we'll start with the actual donor. The donor has had a lot of success developing assisted living centers across the country. This particular one was in Sarasota, Florida. A very key point here are limited partnerships and LLCs, as you know, are simply wrappers of a business entity or of an asset. So in this case, it was actually the real estate of the assisted living center itself. Another very key point here, which you see from the flow chart, is the donor did not give his entire interest in the asset. He gave a partial interest or a fractional interest in the LLC. So when contributing that, the charity then receipted back and acknowledged that partial gift. I think in this case it was about a 4% interest in the LLC. The charity then receives that. In this case it was to a donor advised fund. And then the charity now, along with the donor as the remaining majority owner, looks to sell that LLC interest. More specifically in this case, the buyer did not want to buy the LLC directly, but instead wanted to buy the underlying real estate of the assisted living center itself. In this case, there was a buyer in the wings, not a prearranged sale at all, so that the real estate investment trust ended up being the buyer in this case, came in and purchased the underlying assisted living center from the donor for his proportional ownership and from the charity that sponsored the donor advised fund. So to take a half a step back, let's talk about what the implications of this were. First, this real estate within the LLC had no debt at all. Second, the cost basis or the adjusted tax basis in the real estate was zero. It had been depreciated down over almost 30 years under straight line. So the donor made the contribution of the LLC interest and received a full fair market value deduction for that gift, a qualified appraiser completing a qualified appraisal to substantiate that gift for his tax return. So we used the lowest cost basis asset, highest depreciation that would otherwise have generated a capital gain, and used that to pre-fund his future charitable giving through the donor advised fund. So it worked great, but there are always opportunities as it relates to limited partnerships and traps for the limited partnerships and LLCs, so we're going to cover that next. So let's first talk about the opportunities, because that's more fun to talk about than the traps. So limited partnerships and LLCs, as I mentioned, have an asset or a business inside that wrapper. And very often we find, especially with real estate, that each LLC may have only one asset. So in the case study that I just went through, you're going to have the Chicago Real Estate Investment Trust purchasing that real estate. It was the only asset owned by the LLC. And then the LLC manager would distribute all of the proportional sales proceeds, in this case to the donor and to the charity, and then unwind the LLC or dissolve it. The point here is they can work quite well for limited partnerships or LLCs for outright or life income donations. The charities love them, and they love them, generally speaking, because the limited partnership wrapper or the LLC interest by design is meant to protect the donor from additional potential liability, in particular other claims, environmental, etc. So if the charity is receiving the LLC interest directly, the charity too benefits from that same environmental and other sort of risk mitigation and protection. So now we're going to need to talk about the traps, which are important to discuss too. So for charitable planning considerations with limited partnerships and LLC interests, there are some traps. And to be very clear, I'm covering this whole topic in about 7 to 8 minutes. And this literally would have maybe 100, 200 pages of additional material behind this around all of the exceptions and planning opportunities and other potential landmines too. But in summary, the real 2 key traps to be careful of are: 1, any underlying asset debt. So I mentioned that in the case study that in this case there was no debt on that particular assisted living center. But if it did have debt or if it had active business income, that the debt itself can create what's known as a bargain sale, which is treated as part gift, part sale. The part sale component would be a proportional amount of the debt, but a calculation that would need to be computed to determine what the implications would be for the actual donation. And then to the charity, so the bargain sale is really to the donor, recognizing potentially some capital gain for that proportional amount. To the charity, we need to deal with unrelated business taxable income. And that incurs where you have debt-financed property, in this case the real estate, should it have debt, or you've got active business income, which by definition is unrelated to the charitable exemption and purpose. So during the holding period, even if there's no debt, if the LLC or limited partnership is generating active business income, all of that becomes unrelated business taxable income, which creates unrelated business income tax. So just important to understand the implications from the charity side as part of that due diligence. The next thing that the charity is going to be interested in, so as an advisor you can help counsel or coach your donors and clients through this, and that is in the LLC operating agreement or in the limited partnership agreement, are there any kind of capital calls, other kinds of liability that might come up that would now be the responsibility of the charity? So when charities are reviewing a limited partnership agreement, let's say, and in the agreement it says the general partner at any point in time can ask for a capital call for improvements on the particular real estate subject to some sort of cap. The charities, if there is a cap, the charities don't get overly excited about the words capital calls. So you want to be clear about, are they transferable? Is the interest allowed to be transferred to the charity? And then once it is transferred to the charity, are there any kind of liability provisions that are either open or closed relative to capital calls or other kinds of risks? And as I put a little side note here, general partnerships are usually almost always declined by charities just because of that open-ended liability. So that really covers, in a limited way, summary way, the limited partnership and LLC interests as charitable gifts for either lifetime or estate planning.